Imagine you uncover an ancient, terrifying manuscript. It is filled with vivid, chaotic imagery. We are talking about multi-headed beasts, falling stars, cosmic battles, and, predictions about the end of the world as we know it.
And it is signed by a very famous man.
Right. But there is a massive problem. The brightest minds of the ancient world are looking at this document, and they are screaming that it has to be a forgery.
Oh, yeah. They say the grammar is just a complete disaster.
Yeah, they say the vocabulary is completely wrong compared to everything else this man has ever written. So you as a reader, well, you have a choice. Do you trust the signature on the document, or do you trust the ancient scholars who say the linguistic math just does not add up?
It really is the ultimate historical cold case. I mean, you have ancient testimony colliding head-on with textual forensics.
Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I am thrilled you are joining us for today's deep dive. We are taking a shortcut through the historical detective work behind one of the most debated, scrutinized, and frankly misunderstood texts in all of antiquity.
We are talking, of course, about the Book of Revelation.
We are basing our entire investigation today on the rigorous, objective scholarship found in excerpts from C. Marvin Pate's book, The Writings of John. If you want to be well-informed about the origins, the genuine authorship, and the concrete historical grounding of this ancient vision, well, you are in the right place.
It is going to be a fascinating discussion.
Okay, let's unpack this, because Pate starts by tearing down a very common assumption about how apocalyptic literature actually operates.
He certainly does, and we really have to start there. Because to figure out who wrote this text, we first have to understand the specific nature of the text itself.
That makes a lot of sense.
When modern readers pick up Revelation, they often lump it into a broad, generic bucket of ancient Jewish and Christian apocalyptic literature. We tend to think all ancient doomsday writings follow the same rulebook.
Like they all use the same template.
Spot on. But Pate points out that Revelation operates on a completely different frequency. For starters, it is not pseudonymous.
Wait, let's pause and translate that. Pseudonymous, meaning written under a false name, right? Like a pen name.
That is correct. Or, more accurately in the ancient world, a forged name of a highly respected historical figure.
Oh, wow. So they were basically stealing identities.
Essentially, yes. In antiquity, if you were writing an apocalyptic text, it was incredibly common, almost expected, to hide your true identity. You would attribute your fresh manuscript as someone from the distant, revered past.
So a writer in the first century might claim their new book was actually written by Moses.
Or Abraham or Enoch.
Yes. So it was an ancient marketing strategy. You want people to take your new vision seriously, so you slap the name Moses on it to give it immediate, unquestionable authority.
That is precisely what it was. It was a recognized literary convention of the era. But the author of Revelation does not play that game. He completely breaks the mold.
How so?
He clearly and explicitly states his own name, John, right there in the opening sentence, Revelation 1.1.
He doesn't try to hide behind a patriarch?
Not at all. And he does not just do it once. He repeats it at the end of the text in chapter 22, verse 8. He takes personal, contemporary ownership of the vision.
That is a massive distinction. And there is another convention of that ancient genre that John completely ignores, which is this concept of vaticinea ex eventu.
Yes, that is a big one.
For anyone who does not speak Latin at the breakfast table, let's break that down. It translates roughly to prophecies after the fact, right?
You got it. This is a crucial concept to grasp if we want to understand ancient literature. Vaticinea ex eventu was a highly popular literary trick.
Let me make sure I have the mechanics of this trick right. Let's say I am an author living in the year 100 BC.
Okay, I'm with you.
I write a book, but I claim to be a famous patriarch who lived 1,000 years earlier, say in 1100 BC.
Right, using that pseudonymous strategy we just talked about.
Yeah. Then, speaking in the voice of that ancient patriarch, I write down a prophecy about the rise of the Greek Empire and Alexander the Great.
Which, from your actual standpoint in 100 BC, is just history. It already happened.
Right. But to the reader who believes the book was written in 1100 BC, well, it looks like an impossibly accurate prediction of the future.
It looks miraculous.
I am essentially betting on a sports game after I've already watched the recording. I manufacture predictive credibility, I write down history, call it a prophecy, and when the reader sees that my ancient prediction came true flawlessly, they are completely primed to believe whatever actual future predictions I decide to make later in the book.
It was a highly effective rhetorical device, and it was everywhere in ancient apocalyptic writings. It built trust through chronological deception.
That is wild.
But Pate highlights that John entirely rejects that procedure. John does not use this trick at all.
It plays it straight.
Yes, he firmly plants himself in the contemporary world of the 1st century A.D. He does not pretend to be an ancient figure predicting the rise of the Roman Empire from centuries past.
I mean, he is writing openly as a man currently living under the heavy, dangerous shadow of that very empire.
Precisely. He is not hiding behind the historical mask. He is saying, I am here, right now, in the middle of this mess with you.
Furthermore, Pate points out that John's entire theological outlook is fundamentally different from his contemporaries.
It really is. Many apocalyptic writers in that era were thoroughly pessimistic about God intervening in present history.
They had given up on the current world.
Pretty much. They looked around, saw the oppression, and concluded that the current world was entirely lost, completely irredeemable. For them, all hope belonged to some distant, abstract future reality.
But John does not see it that way.
Not at all. John views the eschatological consummation, which is a dense theological phrase for the final wrap-up of human history, the end of the world as we know it.
Right.
He views it in the same manner as the classic Old Testament prophets. It is not a distant, disconnected fantasy. For John, that consummation has already begun breaking into human history.
How does he see it breaking in?
It is an active process initiated by a specific, literal historical event, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Oh, wow. So the victory has already been secure in history, even if the final implications are still playing out.
Spot on. That theological grounding changes everything about how the text is written.
I think about it like modern communication. If you receive a generic chain letter in your inbox, it has no date, no specific sender. It just floats in the ether, disconnected from reality.
That is a great comparison.
You could read it in 1995 or you could read it in 2025, and it feels the exact same. It is untethered. But Revelation is not a chain letter. It has what scholars call an epistolary framework.
Yes, the structure itself screams that it is a genuine historical artifact. Pate notes there is a formal prescript in chapter 1, verses 4 through 8.
And a prescript in ancient letter writing is like the header of an email.
That is a good way to picture it. It contains all the typical required components of ancient correspondence. It identifies the sender, it names the addressees, it offers a formal greeting, and it includes a doxology.
And then there's a sign-off at the end, too.
Yes, there is a corresponding postscript at the end of chapter 22 summarizing the body of the writing and offering a final sign-off. Plus, the most critical piece of evidence, he is writing directly to 7 actual, geographical, concrete churches located in the Roman province of Asia.
Places like Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, these were bustling, real-world hubs of commerce and politics. He is addressing specific local issues in those cities.
Right, this is direct, targeted correspondence. That analogy of the specific email captures the structural reality perfectly.
So the format itself grounds it in history.
Yes. That epistolary framework alone sets it totally apart from other apocalyptic materials. The combined effect of that prescript, the postscript, and the direct individualized letters to the 7 churches is to root Revelation entirely in the tangible history of its day.
Pate provides a really striking contrast with another ancient text, 1 Enoch, doesn't he?
He does. 1 Enoch is one of those highly influential pseudonymous apocalyptic books we mentioned earlier.
The ones that use a fake ancient name?
Correct. In 1 Enoch chapter 1, verse 2, the text explicitly states that the vision the author saw was not for this generation, but the distant one that is coming.
Wow. He just flat out says it.
He deliberately detaches the text from its immediate contemporary audience. He basically says, this isn't for you guys, it's for people centuries from now.
Which is, frankly, a very convenient way to explain why no one in the current generation has ever heard of this supposedly ancient book.
That is a very astute observation. But Revelation does the precise opposite. It demands to be read, heard, and acted upon by the people of that specific first-century generation.
The people living in those specific Roman cities.
Yes. It is bursting with immediate urgency.
Okay, so since the text itself is practically screaming, I am a real letter written to real people at a specific time by a real man named John, well, the next logical step in our investigation seems pretty straightforward.
Where are we going next?
If I send an email, the people on my contact list know it is me. So what did the ancient contact list have to say? Did the people who lived closest to that era actually believe the Apostle John wrote it?
The external evidence, meaning the testimony of the early church fathers who lived in the decades and centuries immediately following the text's composition, is overwhelming.
It is not really a debate for them.
Not initially, no.
Yeah.
It is nearly unanimous in favor of the opinion that the Apostle John was indeed the author. When historians look for corroborating testimony, they look for witnesses who are as close to the event as possible.
Right, you want the people who were actually there, or at least knew the people who were there.
And Pate lists the absolute heavyweights of early Christian history, validating this claim.
Who are we talking about here?
We are looking at figures like Papias, Justin Martyr, the anonymous author of the Muratorian Fragment, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Hippolytus, Origen, and Methodius.
I want to pause on that list because, to a casual listener, those might just sound like a bunch of dusty ancient names.
They often do.
But in the context of historical verification, those names carry massive weight. We are not talking about isolated scholars writing from a different continent 500 years later.
No, we're talking about individuals with intense geographical and chronological proximity to the original recipients of the letter.
Take Irenaeus, for example.
Irenaeus is a spectacular example of this proximity.
He spent his early life in Smyrna, right?
Yes, he did.
And Smyrna is literally one of the 7 cities directly addressed in the book of Revelation. He grew up in the exact zip code where this letter was received.
And not only that, he actually knew Polycarp.
Yes, Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna. And the historical record strongly indicates that Polycarp was personally mentored by the Apostle John himself.
Let that sink in. The chain of custody is incredibly tight.
So we are not playing a massive, centuries-long game of telephone here. We are looking at a direct, verifiable chain. John teaches Polycarp. Polycarp teaches Irenaeus.
And then Irenaeus writes it down.
So when Irenaeus writes down that the Apostle John authored Revelation, he is not guessing. He is drawing on the direct institutional memory of his own hometown and his own mentor.
That geographical and relational proximity is a crucial factor in historical authentication. The acceptance of Johannine authorship, meaning authored by John, was directly and inextricably tied to the book's canonicity among the early church fathers.
Meaning, because they believed John wrote it, they accepted it as official scripture.
Precisely. If they had doubted the author, they would have rejected the book. The early church had a very high bar for what they considered canonical.
And this consensus was widespread.
The consensus was massive, and it stretched across wildly different geographically isolated regions of the Roman Empire. You have testimony from Gaul, in modern-day France, from North Africa, from Alexandria in Egypt, and from Asia Minor.
And they all independently agreed.
They did. However, in any rigorous historical investigation, we must examine the dissenting voices. We cannot just look at the people who agree.
Right, because history is rarely 100% uniform. Somebody always has an objection.
Always.
So who was looking at this overwhelming consensus and saying, hold on, I don't buy it?
Pate points out that there were notable, highly influential exceptions to this consensus. The primary skeptic was a man named Dionysius.
Who was he?
He was the bishop of Alexandria. He lived from roughly AD 2047 to 264. And his arguments were so potent that they later heavily persuaded Eusebius, who is widely considered the father of church history.
Now, Alexandria was a massive intellectual hub in the ancient world. It had the famous library. It was a center of critical scholarship.
Yes, it was an incredibly academic environment.
So Dionysius was not just some uneducated contrarian. If the historical consensus from people like Irenaeus was so incredibly strong, Dionysius must have had some deeply compelling analytical reasons to object. He wasn't just being contrary for the sake of it.
No, he was a very careful reader. He looked at the actual Greek text and saw things that troubled his scholarly mind.
And that naturally moves our investigation away from the external voices of history and forces us to look under the hood at the internal mechanics of the text itself. Here's where it gets really interesting, because Dionysius formulated 4 very specific, highly analytical internal arguments against the Apostle John writing Revelation.
He was very methodical about it.
Let's look at his first argument.
Dionysius's first argument centers on the mechanics of self-identification. He correctly observed a glaring discrepancy.
What was the discrepancy?
Revelation explicitly names its author as John multiple times, in 1.1, 1.4, 1.9, and 22.8. However, when you read the Gospel of John, or when you read the 3 smaller epistles of John, the author never explicitly names himself.
That is true. He calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved, or the elder.
Right, but he never drops the name John.
So Dionysius is looking at this and thinking, if this is the same guy, why is he suddenly using his actual name here when he went out of his way to be anonymous in his other 4 books?
That was his thought process. Dionysius assumed that if the Apostle John had written Revelation, he would not have felt any sudden compulsion to identify himself by name, since he demonstrably avoided doing so in his gospel and letters.
So what was his conclusion?
Dionysius concluded that Revelation must have been written by a different John, maybe a guy named John the Elder, or just some other prominent Christian leader named John, but not the apostle.
I understand his thought process, I really do, but that logic feels incredibly fragile. It relies entirely on an argument from silence.
Yes, and that is an exceptionally weak foundation for a definitive historical claim.
Yeah.
It's a classic logical fallacy in historical studies.
You cannot definitively prove a negative based on the absence of a behavior in a different context.
You really can't.
Just because I do not sign my name on a casual, everyday sticky note I leave on the fridge for my spouse does not mean I am not going to sign my full legal name on a mortgage document.
That is a perfect analogy. The context changes the behavior.
Furthermore, Pate points out that the social dynamics of how the name is actually used in Revelation work entirely against Dionysius.
How so? Walk me through that.
Look at what the author actually says. He simply says, John. He does not say, John, the supreme apostle, or John, the chief elder of Ephesus, or John, the guy who walked with Jesus.
That is a very good point. He attaches absolutely no grand titles.
No defensive credentials, no resume to his name at all. To write a sweeping, commanding, authoritative letter correcting the behavior of 7 major metropolitan cities and to just sign it John, while it implies that this person possessed an undeniable, universally recognized authority.
He was already intimately known by the churches in Asia Minor.
Yes, that level of quiet, unadorned authority actually lends heavy credibility to it being the apostle himself. A lesser-known John would have had to explain who he was to get them to listen.
That is a brilliant observation regarding the social and relational dynamics of the first century. You only use a single name if everyone already knows who you are.
Like Madonna or Prince.
Precisely. Paters also highlights that, as we discussed earlier, genre dictates form. The apocalyptic nature of the book likely necessitated the author identifying himself to ground the fantastic visions in a credible known source.
Whereas a historical gospel might not require the same authorial intrusion.
Right. So Dionysius' first argument, while observant, falls flat logically.
Okay, so argument 1 is a bust. What was his second argument?
His second argument moves from naming conventions into theological construction.
Okay, theology.
Dionysius argued that Revelation fundamentally lacks the hallmark theological signatures of the Apostle John. Specifically, he pointed out that Revelation does not begin with the identification of Jesus as the Word or the Logos.
Like we see in the Gospel of John.
Yes. Nor does it begin with the author's clear, tangible eyewitness vantage point.
He is comparing the opening of Revelation to the opening of the Gospel of John, which famously starts with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God."
Yes, and he's also comparing it to the first epistle of John.
How does that one open?
That epistle opens by forcefully declaring that the author is writing about what they have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands.
Right, very physical.
Dionysius claimed those massive defining Johannine themes, the Logos and the physical eyewitness testimony, were completely missing from the opening of Revelation.
But wait, did Dionysius just read the text too quickly? Because when you actually slow down and look closely at the first few sentences of Revelation, that claim completely unravels.
It does unravel almost immediately. Pate refutes Dionysius' claim by pointing directly to Revelation chapter 1, verse 2.
What does that verse say?
In that single verse, the author explicitly connects the Word of God with the testimony of Jesus Christ. The concept of the Logos is absolutely present right there in the opening breath of the book.
So Dionysius was looking for a carbon copy of the Gospel's phrasing. And because he didn't find the exact same sentence structure, he assumed the theology was missing.
That is precisely what happened. He confused a variation in expression with an absence of theology.
That is a big academic mistake.
Furthermore, Dionysius entirely missed the immense theological weight attached to the concept of being a witness in Revelation. In the original Greek, this is the concept of martyria.
Let's translate that for the listener, because that sounds an awful lot like where we get the English word martyr.
It is the exact root of that word. In the ancient Greek legal context, martyria meant bearing witness to a fact, giving a factual testimony, often in a court of law.
So it wasn't originally about dying.
No, not at first. Over time, because early Christians were killed for giving their testimony about Jesus, the word evolved to mean someone who dies for their faith.
That makes sense.
But in John's writings, it primarily retains that legal, factual urgency of bearing witness to what is true. Revelation 1.2 and 22.16 heavily feature this specific idea of bearing witness to what was seen in the vision.
Which perfectly mirrors the heavy, relentless focus on witnessing found throughout the Gospel of John and the epistles.
It really does.
The Gospel is constantly talking about John the Baptist being a witness, or the miracles being a witness, or the author himself bearing witness. So the theological construction, upon closer inspection, shares a highly distinct, specialized conceptual framework with the other Johannine literature.
Precisely. So Dionysius's first two arguments, the self-identification and the theological construction, fail when we actually analyze the mechanics of the text, the social dynamics, and the genre conventions.
But he had 4 arguments, right?
Yes, and his next 2 arguments require a much closer, more forensic look. He moved away from broad theological themes and started auditing the actual mathematical vocabulary and the grammatical syntax of the document.
And this is where the detective work gets incredibly granular. Dionysius essentially pulls out a spreadsheet, or, the ancient papyrus equivalent, and starts counting words.
This brings us to Dionysius's third argument, which is a detailed, rigorous vocabulary audit.
What did he find?
Dionysius maintained that the vocabulary of Revelation differs so significantly from the genuine Johannine writings that it is impossible for them to share an author.
He actually made a list, didn't he?
He did. He compiled a list of 19 specific Greek terms. He argued that these 19 words are absolute hallmarks of the gospel and epistles words John uses all the time, and he claimed these terms are entirely 100% missing from Revelation.
And for a long time in church history, this was considered a devastating critique.
It was viewed as a very strong point.
I mean, it looks like hard, objective data. 19 missing words is a lot. But let's walk through Pate's systematic dismantling of this vocabulary claim, because it is fascinating to see how ancient scholarship holds up against modern digital textual analysis.
The comparison is quite revealing.
Wait, if Dionysius claimed 19 specific hallmark words were missing, is he just right? Or did modern scholarship find a massive flaw in his math?
It found a massive flaw. Out of those 19 supposedly missing terms that Dionysius confidently listed, Pate points out that 12 of them actually do appear in Revelation.
12 out of 19. That is a terrible grading curve.
It really is. And we are not talking about obscure, easily overlooked conjunctions or prepositions either.
No, we are talking about crucial, highly significant theological terms, words like life, Zoe in Greek, blood, hema, judgment, crisis, and devil, diabolos.
Yes, Dionysius claimed these were completely missing.
Yet anyone who has read Revelation knows that the concept of life is everywhere. The tree of life, the water of life.
The imagery of blood is central to the apocalyptic visions too.
And judgment is the primary action of the entire book. And the devil is the main antagonist. Dionysius simply missed them.
He just missed them.
How does a brilliant scholar sitting in the intellectual capital of the ancient world miss the word devil in the book of Revelation?
It is a stark reminder of the extreme physical limitations of ancient textual study. We have to understand the mechanics of how Dionysius was reading.
He didn't have a searchable PDF.
He did not have a digital concordance. He could not hit Control F on a keyboard to run a word search across the entire New Testament.
Right, he is reading off a physical scroll or an early codex.
Exactly. And Greek manuscripts of that era were often written in what is called scriptio continua.
What does that mean for the reader?
It means there were no spaces between the words, no punctuation, no lowercase letters, just a continuous, solid block of uppercase Greek text.
Oh, wow. That sounds awful to read.
Manually scanning a 22-chapter document in that format to verify the absence of a specific word is an incredibly tedious, error-prone task.
So he was relying heavily on his own memory and visual scanning.
Yes. The fact that 12 of his 19 words are indeed present severely weakens his entire methodology.
Okay, so 12 words are actually there. He was just wrong. But what about the remaining 7 words on his list?
Pate goes further and analyzes those remaining 7. 3 of those terms, forgiveness, antichrist, and adoption, do not even occur in the Gospel of John either.
What?
Yes. And another term, conviction, is entirely absent from the first epistle of John.
Wait, so Dionysius was holding Revelation to a vocabulary standard that the Gospel and the epistles themselves do not even meet.
It appears so.
He is saying Revelation can't be by John because it doesn't use the word Antichrist, but John doesn't even use the word Antichrist in his own Gospel. That is wildly inconsistent criteria.
It is a flawed standard. That leaves us with just 3 words from the original list of 19.
Let's hear them.
Pate notes that while the specific Greek word for truth might be missing in Revelation, its direct, recognized synonym, genuine, is used repeatedly to convey the exact same theological concept.
So that takes care of truth. What about the others?
The word joy is missing in Revelation, but as Pate points out, joy only appears one single time in each of the 3 letters of John anyway.
It is hardly a ubiquitous, mandatory requirement for Johannine authorship if he barely uses it in his other letters.
Spot on. So we started with a mountain of 19 missing words. 12 were actually there. 4 aren't even consistent across the other books. 2 are easily explained by synonyms or low frequency.
What is left?
When Pate finishes auditing Dionysius's list, the entire imposing argument collapses down to a single, solitary word. Darkness.
One word.
One word. That is the only term that occurs frequently in the other Johannine writings, but is demonstrably absent in Revelation.
And as Pate concludes, one single missing word is hardly enough evidence upon which to base a major sweeping distinction in authorship.
It is just not enough data. The grand vocabulary argument simply does not hold up under careful modern scrutiny.
Okay, so the vocabulary math was wrong. But that brings us to Dionysius's fourth and final point. And honestly, for many people, even modern scholars today, this feels like his strongest, most visceral argument.
It is very persistent critique.
Dionysius claimed that Revelation is written in poor Greek, whereas the Gospel and the letters use a good Greek style.
And he is objectively correct about the linguistic data.
Really?
Yes. The grammar in Revelation is remarkably rough. It breaks conventional rules of syntax. It uses jarring grammatical constructions. The tenses sometimes clash.
So the Greek is actually bad.
Compared to the smooth, flowing, elevated Greek of the Gospel of John, Revelation reads like it was written by someone who was either uneducated or severely distracted.
So let me play devil's advocate here. If the Greek in Revelation is terrible, and the Greek in the Gospel of John is beautiful, doesn't common sense dictate that it has to be 2 different authors? How can one man write a masterpiece of grammar one day and a grammatical disaster the next?
It is a highly valid question, and the linguistic roughness of Revelation cannot be ignored. However, Pate provides 3 historical and contextual answers that resolve this discrepancy perfectly without abandoning the Apostle John as the author.
I am eager to hear these.
First, on a basic human level, an author's writing style is not always perfectly consistent across their entire lifetime or across different moods.
True, a diary entry looks different than a published essay.
Exactly. Second, we have to consider the demands of the genre.
How does the genre affect the grammar?
Apocalyptic writing, with its vivid, jarring, fast-paced, and otherworldly visions, might naturally demand different, more chaotic, stylistic choices than a structured, contemplative historical narrative, like a gospel or a calm pastoral letter.
The form matches the content.
Yes. But the third reason Pate gives is the one I find completely fascinating. It revolves around the physical, geographical setting of the writing, and it paints such a vivid historical picture.
What is it?
It is the amanuensis theory.
Let's unpack that term.
In the ancient world, prominent figures, leaders, and authors almost always used an amanuensis, which is a professional secretary or scribe.
Writing wasn't as easy as grabbing a ballpoint pen.
Far from it. The materials were expensive, the act of writing was physically demanding, so you hired a professional. The Apostle Paul used them regularly. He explicitly mentions a man named Tertius, who physically wrote down the letter to the Romans for him.
And Peter mentions using Silas as a scribe, right?
He does.
So, the standard operating procedure for a prominent leader like the Apostle John, living in the comfortable, established city of Ephesus, would be to use a highly skilled bilingual amanuensis to compose his gospel and his epistles.
That would be the expectation.
John would dictate the sweeping theological concepts, and the professional secretary would ensure the Greek syntax was flawless, the grammar was polished, and the vocabulary was elevated.
That was the absolute standard practice for literary production in antiquity. The polished Greek of the Gospel is likely the combined effort of John's mind and a professional scribe's pen.
But the physical situation for the composition of Revelation was drastically, violently different.
It was a completely different scenario.
We have to look at the internal evidence of where he was. Picture the scene based on Revelation 1.9. John is not sitting in a comfortable, well-lit study in Ephesus surrounded by assistants.
No, he is far from Ephesus.
He has been exiled to the island of Patmos.
And Patmos was not a vacation resort.
No, it was a rugged, barren, isolated rock in the Aegean Sea. The Romans frequently used it as a penal colony, a place to banish political dissidents and religious troublemakers to do hard labor.
It was a brutal environment.
John has been ripped away from his community. He has been stripped of his resources, his library, and critically, his editorial assistants. He has no amanuensis.
He is an older man, isolated on a rocky island under state punishment. He is experiencing these massive, overwhelming, terrifying, and urgent visions.
And he is likely writing them down himself.
Perhaps in a rush, perhaps in poor lighting, without the luxury of revision.
Without his usual professional scribe there to smooth out the syntax, correct the verb tenses, and polish the vocabulary, of course the resulting text is going to reflect poor Greek. It is raw, unedited dictation from a man surviving in exile.
What's fascinating here is how the harsh physical constraints of history perfectly align with and explain the anomalous linguistic data.
It makes perfect sense when you look at the geography.
When you weigh the external, near-unanimous consensus of the early church fathers, the shared theological concepts of witness and the word, and the entirely plausible historical explanations for the vocabulary and stylistic differences, specifically the amanuensis theory, the internal and external evidence solidly point back to the Apostle John.
The evidence does not contradict, it converges beautifully. Placing John alone on a rocky Roman penal colony naturally begs the next massive question for our investigation.
Which is?
When exactly was he trapped on that island? Because determining the date of his exile is the final historical piece of this puzzle, and it dictates how we read and interpret the entire book.
Establishing the date and the specific historical setting is integral to interpreting the text, as Pate shows.
Why does the date matter so much?
The historical context provides the necessary lens through which the original first-century audience would have understood the bizarre fables, the political critiques, and the urgency of the letter.
So what are our options for the date?
Pate outlines that there are two primary competing candidates for the historical setting of Revelation. The first candidate is the reign of Emperor Nero.
That would place the writing specifically between AD 54 and 68. With a particular focus on the aftermath of the Great Fire of Rome, which happened in AD 64.
Correct. During Nero's reign, the persecution of Christians was intense and incredibly violent, but it was largely localized to the city of Rome itself.
What sparked it?
The Roman historian Tacitus tells us that Nero needed a scapegoat for the fire that destroyed much of the city, so he blamed the small, misunderstood Christian community.
This led to horrific, gruesome executions.
It did. If the book of Revelation was written during this window, it is a visceral response to that specific, sudden, traumatizing violence. The symbols would be read as direct references to Nero's madness.
But there is a second candidate for the date, which pushes the timeline decades later.
Yes, the second, and arguably more widely accepted candidate among many scholars, is the time of Domitian's reign.
When was that?
That ran from AD 81 to 96. With a focus particularly on the final few years of his increasingly tyrannical rule.
How was the persecution under Domitian different from the madness of Nero?
During Domitian's era, the nature of the tension shifted from localized scapegoating to systemic bureaucratic oppression.
Less random violence, more legislation.
Yes. Domitian was known for his aggressive, empire-wide promotion of the imperial cult. He demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God.
He weaponized emperor worship.
Exactly. The pressure on Christians was less about being randomly blamed for a fire in Rome and much more about a systemic legal demand to participate in idolatrous emperor worship.
And this was happening where John was.
This is particularly intense in the province of Asia, precisely where the 7 churches addressed in Revelation were located.
So it affected their daily lives.
To participate in the local economy, to buy and sell in the trade guilds, you often had to offer a pinch of incense to the image of the emperor.
And if you refused, claiming that only Jesus is Lord, you were economically ostracized, imprisoned, or exiled, just like John on Patmos.
Yes. So whether the dark shadow looming over the text is the sudden, mad violence of Nero or the cold, systemic, idolatrous legislation of Domitian, drastically shifts how a reader understands the immediate context of the early church's struggle.
It changes how we interpret the political and economic tensions John is addressing in these 7 specific cities. So what does this all mean?
It means a lot for how we approach the text today.
It means that to truly understand this book, you cannot just treat it as a floating piece of abstract mysticism or a generic doomsday prediction. The meticulous historical work required to authenticate its authorship, to understand the lack of a secretary, and to pinpoint its date proves that Revelation is firmly anchored in objective history.
It is grounded in reality.
It is tied to real Roman emperors, real rocky islands, real economic oppression, and real human suffering.
To synthesize our investigation today, we have seen that Revelation is not a pseudonymous fiction, but a carefully constructed letter addressed to real churches by a known leader.
The early church knew who wrote it.
The early Christian community, who lived geographically closest to the source, overwhelmingly affirmed the Apostle John as the author. And when we examine the sharp dissenting voice of Dionysius, his internal critiques regarding vocabulary and style fell apart once we accurately accounted for the apocalyptic genre, the ancient necessity of secretaries, and the harsh, unfiltered realities of John's physical exile.
I want to leave you with a final thought to consider, something that builds directly on the evidence we have investigated today. Consider how physical limitations and suffering shape human communication.
That is a fascinating angle.
We often prefer our sacred texts to be polished, flawless, and linguistically perfect. We want the grammar to be pristine. But if John's raw, unedited, rough Greek from the penal colony of Patmos is indeed the result of his isolation, it provides an unfiltered, highly vulnerable glimpse into his mind during a time of extreme duress.
It strips away the polished veneer.
It really does. Perhaps the lack of a professional Ephesian secretary actually gives the modern reader a more authentic, intimate connection to the author's actual voice than the perfectly polished grammar of the Gospel of John.
It is John without the filter.
It challenges us to think about how isolation, fear, and suffering impact the way human beings document their greatest, most urgent convictions. The rough grammar of Revelation is not a flaw to be explained away. It is the forensic fingerprint of a man writing for his life on a rock in the agency. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thank you for listening.